Hey, what's up everyone? Welcome to 90 Day Fiancé latest news. The day began like any other, regular, even a touch boring. As usual, Julia Trubkina and Brandon Gibbs woke early and had coffee in their tiny but comfortable house. Brandon had seemed good, chatting about their forthcoming plans, cracking jokes about the neighbors and surfing his phone. That evening they were meant to go, just a modest supper, something little, a much-needed respite from the craziness of life. Then though everything changed suddenly. It had begun with something little, just a twitch of his hand, a short vertigo he laughed off. He had said, probably just stood up too fast. But Julia had observed his temple-rubbing technique, and the way his smile wavered just for a moment. She had inquired as to his condition. He had comforting words for her. Only minutes later then it happened. Brandon had been mid-sentence when his facial change. He gripped his chest and his eyes widened, panic flickering through them. His body abruptly no longer his own, he gasped and staggered back. "Brandon!" Julia had yelled, dropped everything and ran toward him. Before his legs gave out beneath him, he hardly managed to whisper, I can't breathe." His body seized for a single second before going strangely still as he fell to the floor. Silence descended the room for a fleeting, terrible moment. Julia had yelled his name, shook him, her heart hammering so fiercely she felt it could explode. Her hands shaking so violently she nearly dropped her phone, so she could hardly think. She choked the words out of 911, her voice hardly audible. "My husband, he is not breathing, kindly help." The following 5 minutes melted together. Arriving, the paramedics spoke sharply and urgently. They investigated his pulse. They yelled messages to one another. They turned him onto a stretcher. Julia followed, seeing from the outside as though she were caught in a dream. There is nothing real about this. It cannot be occurring this way. But it was exactly what it was. The ambulance trip was a whirl of flashing lights, beeping monitors, and siren-distant sound. Julia sat paralyzed, clutching Brandon's limp hand, and murmuring prayers she hadn't even noticed she remembered. Everything at the hospital moved too quickly when they got there. Julia was left standing there powerless, unable to follow as the physicians hauled him away and pushed his stretcher through the double doors. Asking questions, attempting to cool her off, a nurse stopped her but nothing made sense. Her man had passed out. Her husband had ceased to breathe. Her spouse might be no. She wouldn't allow her imagination go there. Minutes felt like hours as she sat in the waiting area, her hands locked into fists. She scarcely saw the other people around her. The frightened parents, the elderly man staring at the floor, the mother cuddling her child. She felt cut off from the planet, as though she lived in another dimension entirely. At last, following what seemed to be a lifetime, a doctor walked up. Julia stood so fast she almost lost her equilibrium. The doctor responded, "He's stable." And Julia almost passed out with relief. Her voice almost above a whisper, she asked, "But what happened?" The doctor faltered. He had a really bad panic attack. His body flew into hyperdrive, and for a split second his heart almost stopped. Simply said, the tension was too much for him to manage. Julia's head whirled. An outbreak of panic? Brandon had always been the tough one, the one who never let tension control him, so it seemed impossible. Then she considered what he had been carrying recently. All the pressure, the expectations, the unsaid weight. She might have overlooked the indicators. She asked furiously, "Can I see him?" Nodding, the doctor pointed, "He still is weak, but yeah, he had been requesting you." Except for the soft hum of the machines and the heart monitor's periodic beeping, the room was silent. Brandon, lying on the hospital bed, his face pale, his body hooked to cables and IVs, sent Julia a fresh surge of panic. She went carefully, nearly timidly, until she got to his side. His hand rested slack on the blankets. She stretched out and tightly grabbed it in both of hers. She muttered, "Brandon." Nothing at all for a time. His fingers then started to twitch gently. His eyelids danced. His lips opened to try to talk. "You promised me a dance tonight following dinner," she said, her voice shaking. "Remember?" His lips curved into the weakest smile. "I haven't forgotten," he said quietly. "Just need a rain check." She started a little chuckle, but it mixed with tears. She said, "You scared me," acknowledged. "When the doctors declared it was a panic attack, that your heart almost stopped." Brandon weakly spoke while swallowing hard. He said, "I'm sorry," in whispers. I never intended to subject you to this. Don't apologize, she murmured, shaking her head. Just concentrate on getting better. Together, we have far more to do. She bent in and rested her forehead on his. His fingers gently curled around hers, and for the first time since this dream started, she let herself breathe. Julia refused to go from his side as the hours went by. When the sun sank, she hardly noticed the room darkening. Her phone pulsed on the chair next to her, a stream of missed messages and calls. She paused, then grabbed for it, her hands still wobbly. Her fingers hovering over the keyboard, she started to type. Brandon has been hospitalized for extreme anxiety that resulted in a panic attack. To all of our friends and supporters. His heart nearly stopped. We owe the medical staff that saved him thanks. Over this period, kindly keep him in your thoughts and prayers. To us, your support is absolutely priceless. She hesitated and then struck post. She felt alone no more for the first time in what seemed like eternity. Right now the hospital was quieter. Except for the sporadic rounds by a nurse, the halls were deserted. Exhaustion dragging at her, Julia curled up in the recliner next to Brandon's bed, but she resisted closing her eyes for too long. She would glance at him every so often and see his chest rise and fall. Then he moved in the dead of darkness. His fingers twitched against the bedsheets, his breathing shifted just little. Julia sat straight away, her heart thumping. Julia? His voice was no more than a breath rough. She turned to grab his hand. I'm right here. Are you in need of anything? Brandon's lips slightly opened, his voice gentle yet definite. Just you. Tears welled in Julia's eyes, a fresh wave, but these were not tears of anxiety. Leaning down to kiss his forehead, she let out a short laugh. She said, always, in a whisper. She also let herself imagine that everything would be fine for the first time in what seemed like eternity. This gossip is over. If you liked the video, then give your opinion in the comment box and stay with us by subscribing the channel. Thank you.